Bruchim Habaim. Bruchim Habaim, a blessing of welcome on everybody who's come to this wonderful event. I believe it's the 24th annual Jewish Book Fair. And the first two things I'm super grateful for. One is that you have honored PJTC by holding this the final event of this series here with us. And so thank you for that. The other thing that I really appreciate is that you finally are showcasing a book with pictures. So I've got my crayons at home all ready to go. So why it's so important to me that this happens here and why I'm so grateful for it is three values that are very strong among our people. And one is literacy, is wisdom, is the pursuit of knowledge in the written word, not called the people of the book for nothing. And so that's why we're glad to support these kinds of events. Another Jewish value that is very present tonight is educating our children. So ecstatic to see all the wonderful PJ library books here, and that we have ways for people to teach all ages, all learning styles, like the 4 children at Passover, being able to tell the stories and give the guidance to people at the level that they are at so that they keep growing. And the third Jewish value that's very present this evening is humor. And was just really delighted to hear about the selection for this particular evening. I've been an admirer of the New Yorker and its cartoons for a long time, and also especially the work of tonight's author, because Jewish humor has always been very important to me. As I've told some of you, I learned to read from Mad Magazine, so not the New Yorker. Maybe teach my kids out of the New Yorker. But why humor is important, not just because of the joy that it brings, and we are dedicated to giving people lives of joy, but because humor allows us to talk about hard things. And I don't know a people that's had harder things to talk about. But to talk about those in an effective way that we can process without shying away from difficult conversations. And it also, I find in my teaching, humor aids in memory and retention. And with the art that you see tonight, it's not just the expression of the written word, but it's the expression in a way that really builds emotion around what you're learning, whether that's emotion of laughter, the emotion of crying, and at its very best, both. Because those emotional connections aid in our memory, aid in our processing, and really help us take in the values that we're reading, and then we can go teach those values to our children. So all the more so, I want to thank the Federation for having this event here this evening, and I want to thank Linda and Debbie and everybody, and all the guys with the wires, and all the guys with the skillets, and all the people with the musical instruments. This is a wonderful event that we are very proud to have at PJTC. On behalf of the whole congregation, let me say thank you, and once again, Bruchim Habaim. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Rabbi. Okay, good evening, and welcome to the closing event of the 24th Annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. Debbie Singer and I, Linda Mazer, are co-chairing this event, and we're very happy you all came out tonight. Before we begin, I want you to locate the exits in case of an emergency. One over here, one back there, and another one there. Okay. First, I want to thank PJTC for hosting this event with the Jewish Federation, and to thank you to the board members. We have 2 here tonight, John Carlton and Julie Solberg, and the rest are on Zoom. Welcome. And to those, and Rabbi Carrier for his lovely welcome, and to Nancy Carlton and the Temple Sisterhood for the beautiful reception we're going to have after the presentation. This evening's program will be a presentation by David Sipress, followed by Q&A. If you are watching virtually and have questions, go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and write them in. For those of you here in person, silence your cell phone, and afterwards you'll be able to ask your questions. If you wish to purchase the book or any other books for this year's book festival, there are plenty of them still available on the tables in the back, and if you're on Zoom, you can click the link in the chat. And we also have signed book plates from the author, so those are available too. And now, to set the tone for tonight's author, classical and jazz pianist Amy Rowe is back again and has arranged a medley for her trio, Saluting New York. I give you Amy Rowe Trio.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having the trio here today. Oh, thank you so much. That was a little medley that I put together, starting off with Let's Call the Whole Thing Off, inspired by the change in Zoom. So we thought, well, what are we going to do? Let's call the whole thing off. Followed by a couple other things. Well, summertime. Well, only us in California get to enjoy summertime in December. So I was trying to fit in some ironic songs for this evening. So we have one more to end the set before going on to David Sipress.
Thank you. Okay, okay, thank you. Okay, so I want to thank Amy Rowe on the piano, Zach Moses on bass, and Anthony Fung on drums. Thank you for the beautiful tribute to New York City. Okay, and now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, David Sipress. David was born and raised in New York City. He graduated from Williams College in 1968 and studied Russian history at Harvard University, before leaving to pursue a career as a cartoonist. He has been a staff cartoonist at the New Yorker since 1998, publishing over 700 cartoons for the magazine. During the 2012 presidential election, he was NewYorker.com's first daily cartoonist. His work has also appeared in the Boston Phoenix, Time, Parade, Playboy, Funny Times, the Washington Post, Harper's, and a host of a lot of other publications. He has lectured widely on the art of the cartoon, and he was the writer and host of Conversations with Cartoonists, a series of on-stage interviews with many of the artists who contribute to the New Yorker. And he has written both fiction and nonfiction for the magazine. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, an attorney and activist who works on issues of health and housing. Thank you, David, for joining us. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I wish I could have been there in person, but one of my knees didn't want to go. So I'm sorry that it has to be this way, but here we go. I'm going to talk about my memoir. It's called What's So Funny? A Cartoonist Memoir. And the book is about these people. My father, Nathan, who you see on the left, at this point in his life, which was 1953, he had achieved his lifelong dream of becoming a totally assimilated New York American success story. And I emphasis on totally assimilated. On the right is my mother, Estelle, looking joyful and sweet, as she always did, with what I refer to in the book as her outside face, which made it very difficult for anyone to ever believe that my mother could be anything but sweet. And behind the scenes, that sometimes was the case. In the middle is my sister, Linda, whose troubled life and tragic story is another thread in the book. And down below there, you see me, already with the look on my face of mischief that I was about to cause for the rest of my life, and holding a gun, which back then, parents had yet to make the connection between toy guns and actual gun violence. And so this was the 1950s. I'm going to start by reading you a bit from the introduction to my book. I was born and raised in New York City. You could say that there's nothing particularly special about that, but deep down, I've always felt that there is. Perhaps it's a simple fact that almost all the New Yorkers I have come to know came to the city from somewhere else. I'm from here. Being a New Yorker from the get-go has permanently affected my worldview. The sun rises on the Upper East Side and sets on the Upper West Side. This cartoon was published in the New Yorker in 2001, making it one of the first I sold to the magazine after 25 years of submitting and being rejected. The idea came to me in the summer of 2000 when I was walking south on Fifth Avenue after an afternoon visit to the Met. Around 72nd Street, the memory of another long ago walk on Fifth Avenue popped into my head, and out popped the cartoon. It works that way sometimes, the out-of-the-blue arrival of a fully formed idea. The memory in question involved my parents, my older sister, and me. I was 8 years old. The four of us had gone out to dinner one early summer evening at my parents' favorite restaurant, Gino's, on Lexington Avenue, across the street from my father's jewelry shop. There are always well-known people dining at Gino's. A few weeks before, we were there with a friend of my parents, and he pointed out Charles Adams, the famous New Yorker cartoonist, sitting at the bar. I remember thinking that he looked just like one of his drawings, which was something people would say about me one day. That night, we also saw the actor Montgomery Clift, who was a customer of my father's, sitting at a small table with Arthur Miller, whose literary accomplishments paled, as far as I was concerned, beside the fact that he was married to Marilyn Monroe. As we were on our way out of the restaurant, my father stepped back and reverently held the door for the arriving Bess Meyerson, famous television personality and the first Jewish Miss America. My family's relaxed, primarily secular Jewishness was a complicated and sometimes confusing affair. As a kid, I understood that Jewish was just one thing we were, more fundamental perhaps, but not all that different from our being New Yorkers or Democrats or Brooklyn Dodgers fans. On the other hand, we were always quick to root for and celebrate members of our tribe who broke barriers and made it big: athletes, scientists, writers, artists, actors, diplomats, and smart, talented beauty queens like Bess Meyerson. It wasn't dark when we walked out onto Lexington Avenue. There was a fancy black limousine parked in front of the restaurant. A uniformed chauffeur was leaning against the fender, holding a leash, at the end of which a little French poodle leapt back and forth, barking like a maniac at the door of Gino's. "He's funny," I said to my mother. "I wonder who he belongs to." "Whoever it is, they better own a pair of earplugs, my father said. The poodle came over and looked me up and down and barked at me like I was the problem. "Don't get too close," my mother warned. "It's the little ones that really bite." "Let's go," my sister pleaded. She was always impatient, especially when the four of us were out together. My mother suggested that we take a walk on Fifth Avenue before getting a taxi back to our apartment on the Upper West Side. "All right, but I just hope we can find a cab," said my father, suddenly sounding grumpy for no apparent reason, as so often was the case. "They aren't so frequent on Fifth," he explained. "Fifth goes downtown," my sister chimed in. "They won't want to take us." "All we can do is ask," said my mother. "Maybe we can ask Fifth to go uptown," I said. My mother laughed. We walked in spite of my father's misgivings, still hearing the poodle halfway to Park Avenue. When we turned onto Fifth, as taxi after taxi, vacant taxi, sped by without my father lifting a hand to signal, I looked up and was startled by the sight of the dreamy, sparkling skyline of Central Park South and Midtown Manhattan, silhouetted against a dusky pink sky, and I felt a powerful urge of desire. When I grow up, I told myself, I was going to escape the New York of my parents and find a way into the New York I saw glittering above the treetops of Central Park. It would be New York full of cool, amazing, talented people, like the actors and famous writers and artists I saw dining at Gino's, people who didn't need to worry about every little thing. I would be an artist too, I decided. What kind of artist would I be? I knew that I loved to draw. I also knew that I was funny. At least my mother thought so. I did the calculation. Drawing plus funny equals cartoonist. So, as I said, my book is mainly about my family and the story of my life with my family. And I realized at one point I could actually summarize the whole story in a single cartoon. Oh, sorry. I just want to say before I say that, writing the book was a challenge for me at first. I'd only ever really written cartoon captions, and the idea of writing a whole book really seemed really daunting. And there were other issues. I was worried that my memory of things wasn't exactly accurate. But pretty soon I became to realize something you learn in therapy, that the stories you tell yourself about the past, whether they're accurate and fact-checked, doesn't really matter. What matters is that those stories say a lot about yourself, and they're much more significant than any fact-checked history could possibly be. And then there was this problem. Nothing interesting has ever happened to me, a memoir, which is how I felt at the beginning of this writing process. However, I started writing, and as I started writing, the stories kept coming to me more and more. And I thought next I would read you one of my favorite, maybe my favorite story in the book, which begins, as I preemptorily showed, this cartoon. This chapter is called My Christmas Story. This cartoon of mine from 2006 is among my most autobiographical. Not that my father and I ever actually went into the woods together, unless you count Central Park, and I don't think he ever chopped down a tree. What's autobiographical is the confusion I felt as a child over the fact that my family, like many Upper West Side Reform Jewish families in the 1950s, celebrated both Hanukkah and Christmas. We celebrated the two holidays in separate rooms, Christmas in the living room and Hanukkah in the kitchen, so that we wouldn't get them mixed up, I guess, or perhaps to prevent contamination. In the kitchen on a baking sheet so the candle wouldn't drip on anything was our gold-painted menorah. In the living room, presents were piled under the piano until Christmas morning. Even for dedicated assimilators like my parents, a Christmas tree would have been a bridge too far. On Christmas Eve, over the presents, my mother would play Christmas carols while I sat beside her on the piano bench and sang along, often mystified by the strange, incomprehensible lyrics. For instance, Bells on Bobtail's Ring, or Round Yon Virgin, or what sounded to me like Deck the Halls with Boughs of Challah. The 2 weeks before Christmas were the busiest of the year for my father. He would open his jewelry shop on 61st Street and Lexington Avenue at 8 a.m. and stay until the last customer finished shopping at 9 or 10 at night. The fact that Christmas season was so busy in the store made my father's Christmas shopping for my mother a bit of a challenge. She would have been happy to shop for her own presents and save him the trouble. Saving him the trouble was her life's work. But to his credit, he wouldn't cross that line. So every year for an hour or so, my mother would hold down the fort at the shop while my father hurried out to get her gifts. The year I was 6, about to turn 7, I was with my mother when she arrived at the shop ready to take over. We had been to Bloomingdale's to see Santa, just to see him, because I wasn't allowed to sit on his lap, the reason being some version of, we don't know where it's been. It was decided that I could go along with my father while he did his shopping. It was a cold, late afternoon. We were heading for the shop of a Japanese dressmaker who, barely 5 feet tall herself, specialized in clothes for tiny women like my mother. My father wore an elegant camel hair coat and a cashmere scarf. I wore a miniature replica of the same coat, with wool mittens attached to the sleeves by metal clips and a peaked wool cap with ear flaps covered by earmuffs, my mother insisted. My father was hatless as usual, oversized ears turning bright red after a few seconds in the cold, his thick gray mustache frosty and stiff. The excursion was special for me. I really spent time alone with my father. On Sundays, his single day off, he was exhausted and preoccupied. As we walked east on 61st Street and turned down First Avenue, he did the one thing that reliably dissolved all the questions I might have about where I stood with him. He took my hand and held it as we walked. The dressmaker greeted us warmly in her small shop. After an exchange of pleasantries and some mutual commiseration about running a small business during the holidays, my father said, "I want to get something nice for Estelle." "Oh, yes," the dressmaker said, and making a show of giving the matter some thought before plunging into the overstuffed rack and pulling out a dress that my mother had selected weeks before. My father said it was perfect. The dressmaker wrapped it up nicely and placed it in a brown paper bag so that my mother wouldn't know what it was. It was already dark when we stepped outside. "Mission accomplished," my father said, mainly to himself. "And I've got that jade necklace I've been saving for her all year back at the shop. Let's take a little walk," he then suggested, and we turned at the next corner. In the middle of the block was a small red brick church. Behind a low wrought iron fence was a garishly floodlit nativity scene. "O Come All Ye Faithful" or something similar was playing. We stopped. The nativity scene reminded me of the dioramas I loved at the Museum of Natural History, with cavemen and wild animals. My memory of the nativity scene is vivid, because it was my first. It included life-size statues of the standard 3 humans, and more exciting for me, a cow, a sheep, a goat, and real straw and hay. "Why are they in a barn?" I asked my father. I took off my earmuffs so I could hear. "It's all they could afford," he said. "How should I know? Let's get going. It's cold, and it's getting late." "Isn't it smelly?" We had recently visited my mother's cousin in Connecticut, and they had taken me to a farm where you could pet the animals. What had most impressed me was the smell. "Don't the animals go to the bathroom right there?" "Yes, no, they probably go outside. Let's hope so, at least." "That's Jesus," I said, pointing to the baby. He was chubby and pink and reminded me of the phrase "tender and mild in Silent Night," one of the songs my mother and I sang together. The words made the baby sound like something good to eat. "What are the parents' names?" I asked. "Joseph and Mary." And those guys in the background on the camels? He pointed to a painted backdrop leaning against the wall of the church. Those are kings, supposedly. What are kings supposedly? I meant it's just a story. Did they have countries? Why are they coming on camels? They're bringing presents for the baby. Where is Santa? What? The North Pole, I guess. Come on, David, let's vamoose. He took my hand, but I didn't budge. When Jesus grows up, he gets crucified, I told him. They hammer nails into him. What? How do you know about that? The movie, the one about the bathrobe. The what? Last Easter, I had watched the robe on television one afternoon with my sister Linda. There was a wonderful scene in which Richard Burton, playing Marcellus, a Roman tribune, arrives at Pilate's palace along with another soldier, a centurion. As Marcellus walks in, Pilate is washing his hands. Pilate says that he has a final task for Marcellus before the tribune goes off on a new assignment on Capri. An execution, 3 criminals. One of them is a fanatic. There might be trouble. Pilate says he's had a rough night, and looking dazed and distracted, he requests a bowl to wash his hands. A slave tells him that he's just washed them a minute ago. So I did, says Pilate, and he exits, zombie-like. Then the centurion asks Marcellus, perhaps the most hilarious deadpan question in the history of cinema. Your first crucifixion? Yes, Marcellus mumbles, staring down at the scroll containing his orders. What? The centurion says. Never driven nails into a man's flesh? The movie where they make Jesus carry the big cross up the hill, I explained to my father, so they could hammer the nails into his flesh and hang him up on it. You mean the robe, my father said. We were both silent for a few seconds, contemplating the pink plaster infant in his mother's arms with the very bad death in his future. Linda says Jesus was Jewish, but the Jews wanted to kill him anyway. What was he, Daddy? Jewish or Christian? He was Jewish, he replied. Christians hadn't been invented yet. But the Jewish people wanted him dead. We have to go, David, my father said, pulling on my arm. But I'll tell you all about it, but now we have to mosey. Do they kill the camels to make our coats? He didn't reply to that one. We started walking. Here's the deal with Jesus in a nutshell, he said. When he grew up, he started telling everyone he was the Son of God, and I looked back at the church and pointed. But wasn't he the son of Joseph and Mary? Didn't he come from his mommy? Yes, but he kept saying otherwise. He kept saying his mommy was a virgin. Round yon virgin, I thought, but she hadn't looked round. He told everybody that God sent him directly to earth to be his son and save the world, supposedly. Then what happened? Well, he started wandering all over the place in Israel, teaching people about religion and collecting a bunch of followers who started claiming that he was performing miracles. What's miracles? Tricks, like magic tricks, like walking on water. But you can't do that, I said. I was already thinking that I would give it a try next summer at the beach. That's why they're miracles. But you're right. It was all a bunch of baloney. Anyway, the other Jews, the ones in charge, started hearing he was saying that he was the Son of God, and they got mad. Why? He got too big for his britches. This I understood. I'd been scolded many times for the very same crime. So when he wouldn't keep his mouth shut, they complained to the Romans, who were in charge of everyone back then. But nobody blames the Romans. Everyone blames the Jews, which is why we've had so much trouble from Christians even today. They hate our guts, Linda told me. Not all of them. Some do, but not all of them. For a couple of blocks, I thought about the Christians I knew, my teacher, a few friends at school, our housekeeper, our elevator man, wondering which ones hated my guts. At Lexington Avenue, we turned uptown. In front of Bloomingdale's, we passed a Salvation Army Santa. Is Santa God, I asked? Is he Jesus' father? What? No, enough with the questions, David. Now we could see the shop a block away and my mother's head in the window. Is he Christian? Yes, he's Christian. He's based on some saint, the one in charge of presents. Speaking of which, he held up the paper bag and smiled at me. Don't tell your mother what's in here. Is that how he can get in our apartment when we don't have a chimney and all the doors are double locked? Is it a miracle, like walking on water? I don't know. Ask your mother. He pulled me along as he picked up the pace. Why do we have Christmas since Santa is Christian and we're Jewish and some of them hate us? Because we're Americans, he answered. His eyes were on the shop. But if they hate us, enough with the questions, David. He looked at me and gripped my hand tighter. It's just a holiday, so we can have presents, understand? That's it, case closed. But Hanukkah has presents. Oy, he sighed. Hanukkah's too long. Doing it all in one day makes more sense. Some of us have to work. What's a virgin? I asked as I stumbled after him across 61st Street. Someone from Virginia. So, as I said, my book is mainly about my family. And I managed to do one cartoon in my life that I think summed up the whole story of my family. I'll show it to you now. Here's the deal. We call the shots when you're young. You call the shots when we're old. And everything in between is a nonstop battle for control. My book about my family isn't always funny like the excerpt I just read you. Some of it can be serious and some of it painful. And the trick for me as a writer who's mainly works in the field of humor, was how do I write about those difficult things without changing that tone, without losing that tone of humor? The fact is that when I first finished my first draft and I showed it to my wife, she joked that she had to have 2 therapy sessions before she had the conversation with me, where she told me it wasn't good. The problem, she said, is it's not funny. So I went back and spent another year and a half rewriting it. And this time I made it funnier. Even the difficult things and the painful things, I tried to leaven them a bit with humor. And I started adding a lot more cartoons. For example, when I dropped out of Harvard, it was a very bad day for my father. Actually, I didn't actually tell him until about a month after, when I got up the courage to call him. And his response was pretty devastating for me and led me to do something really stupid and really dangerous. But of course, at some point, thinking back on it, I came up with a cartoon about the whole thing. You're quitting school after everything we sacrificed for you? So the other thing, another theme of my book is about cartooning and about the art of cartooning and my creative process. People often ask cartoonists, well, where do you get your ideas? And we all have snarky, responses, Paris or whatever. But really, I can't answer that by saying I get them from my life. When I go to my studio in the morning and sit down and try to come up with cartoons, I don't think, oh, I'm going to do a funny joke today. I think about what I've experienced in my life. And one thing I've discovered writing the book is that there's almost nothing I've experienced in my life that I haven't made a cartoon about at some point. Of course, one of the main, most fertile grounds for cartoon ideas, not just for me, but for a lot of artists, is my anxiety and my worries. I always seem to go there to find cartoon ideas. For example, the worries I might experience about what's going on in the world. My desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. This, by the way, is my most popular cartoon, the most copied, stolen, reprinted. Every time the world goes down the toilet, this cartoon starts appearing all over the place on the internet. And what's interesting about it is, as I said, it's not actually a joke, but the humor is what I've discovered in the course of 50 years of doing this. The humor is in the connection I make with the reader. I'm expressing something that I'm feeling. And what's miraculous to me is when I put it out there, it turns out that my audience is feeling and thinking the same thing. And it's that connection which creates the humor. Of course, among my worries, naturally, would be medical issues. And they've often resulted in cartoons for me. Here's one I did a few years ago. I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. And of course, if you want to talk about worries and anxieties, you got to include this guy. Don't freak out. It's just to save the date. Sometimes people ask, where do the ideas come from first? Do they come from, what comes first to you, the drawing or the caption? And usually I have to say that they come all together most of the time. However, once in a while, it begins with a drawing. I had done this drawing several years ago, and it sat on my wall for a really long time, and I looked at it and looked at it. I knew that there was a cartoon idea in there, but I couldn't come up with it. I went out, got myself a coffee, came back, and when I sat down at my desk again, this popped into my head. I ran out of room. When those kinds of ideas happen, it's honestly an unbelievable high. It's my whole mind sort of explodes with joy. I love it when ideas come that way out of the blue, when I least expect them. And it's what makes me love what I do more than anything else. Another thing I always talk about, and I talk about it in the book about the source of cartoon ideas, is something I think of as my cartoon brain. This is the part of me that's always thinking, no matter what situation I'm in, even right now, talking to you on Zoom, some little part of my brain is thinking, what's funny in this? Is there a cartoon here? I can't help myself. And the best example of that I can give you is this little story about an argument several years ago. My wife Ginny and I were having. It was a rather fierce argument. And we were going back and forth. And then suddenly she took a look at me and she said, David, are you thinking up a cartoon right now? Oh, no, absolutely not. Not possible. I'm certainly not doing it. And then about 4 weeks later, she opened up her New Yorker and saw this. Well, if it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? So that cartoon brain of mine is always working. And that may be my most fertile source of ideas. So as I mentioned before, in my reading, took me 25 years to get into the New Yorker. And that was an extremely difficult period for me. Finally, in 1997, the cartoon editor changed and I sold my first cartoon. The story about that is that my father, whose approval I sought my whole life, never could really get his mind around the fact that I was a cartoonist. He always was saying, do you think maybe you want to go back to Harvard? When he was in his store all those years ago, and a customer would come in, he'd be talking to the customer and that emerald necklace, this, then he'd say, by the way, did I mention my son is at Harvard? That really meant everything to him. So when I told him that I wanted to be a cartoonist, he didn't like that very much. He had a whole other series of ideas of professions for me, and cartoonist was not among them. So he was impressed by the New Yorker. And the day I sold my first cartoon after 25 years, after I called my wife, the first person I called after that was my father. And he elicited a little bit of pride, a little bit of interest, and that meant the world to me. However, what I didn't understand was that when you sell a cartoon to the New Yorker, it doesn't appear that week or even the next week, maybe not for a long time. So after about a week or two, I started getting calls from my father. I got my New Yorker today. You're not in it. Oh. Then about 2 weeks after that, I got my New Yorker today. You're not in it. Are you sure you sold that cartoon? And the sad ending to this story is that I sold the cartoon in October, and my father died at the end of December. And the cartoon didn't come out till the following July, so he never got to see it, which was a very sad thing for me. All those years of being out in the wilderness, by the way, elicited this cartoon. Hey, I thought, hold on a minute. Maybe failure is an option. But I kept submitting and I kept submitting. And finally, I got in and fulfilled a dream I'd had since I was a kid. Even when I was a little kid of 6 or 7, I would draw cartoons and cut them out and scotch tape them into my parents' magazine, New Yorker magazines, over the Steigs and the Steinbergs, just to make myself think I was actually a New Yorker cartoonist. So the day I sold that first one was really one of the great days of my life. Finally, one more thread in my book is the story about this. This photograph was taken the day before my father and his family, that's my father on the bottom right, left Ukraine to come to this country on a very difficult journey. And one of the mysteries of my life was why my father was so secretive about that immigrant past. He had some kind of break with his family as a young man, and he never looked back. We never knew them. We never spent time with them. He just completely cut himself off. And the reason for that remains shrouded in mystery. I got a little bit of a sense of it by the end of my book. I write about that. But really, to the end, all I ever got from him were stories like this. The country Papa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty, where everyone was always happy. That kind of ambiguity about the past really frustrated me. And I think it had a lot to do with my father's dedication to being assimilated. And I thought I would conclude by reading you one more excerpt from the book. I think there's just about time for that. And in it, a moment in my life happens where it becomes clear to me something about my father and all that assimilation. When I ask people my age how they heard that President Kennedy had been shot, most tell some version of the same story. They were in school, in class. The principal enters the room looking shaken and pale. He or she walks over to the teacher, whispers something in the teacher's ear. The teacher's eyes well up. The terrible announcement is made, and everyone is sent home. This would have been my story. I was 16 then. But on that Friday, I was excused from school early for a doctor's appointment. I had lots of doctor's appointments. Not that there was actually anything wrong with me. My mother was always taking me to some doctor or another on the chance that something was wrong, something she hadn't discovered yet. And it was better to catch it before it got worse. Things were normal when I got on the subway at Van Cortlandt Park for the 45-minute ride home. There were just a few passengers reading their newspapers or staring into space. But at 168th Street, a large crowd, too many people for that late a morning, streamed in through the doors. Several were crying. One lady in tears made an announcement to the entire car that the president had been shot. People were frantic, shouting questions at each other. Nobody had answers. Everyone looked frightened. I felt scared, and I felt alone. As we headed downtown, the scene was repeated at every stop. As soon as I rang the doorbell to our apartment, my mother opened the door and pulled me inside. "Are you all right?" she gasped. She slammed the door and double-locked it to keep out any assassins. "I'm fine," I answered, but without the usual sting of irritation in my voice. "Are you sure you're all right?" "He's here, Nat," she announced in the direction of the living room. "He's fine." "Go to your father," she said. "He's watching Cronkite. I'll get you some lunch. He won't eat." She headed for the kitchen, where she had a small TV of her own. The drapes in the living room were pulled shut. The only light came from our black and white Zenith TV. Ever since I could remember, the TV had resided in my parents' bedroom, affording maximum control. My father said nothing. He gestured with his hand that I should sit beside him on the couch while he continued to watch. Walter Cronkite was speaking, his face worried and sad. It was startling to see my father home on a weekday. He worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week at the shop. He never got sick. Days off are for rich people, he often told me. My father's presence in the apartment in the middle of the day was unprecedented. His appearance was even more of a shock. As I have already mentioned, he was fastidious about his clothes to the point of obsession. Along with his closet full of three-piece suits made for him by his longtime tailor to fit his tiny frame, he had a world-class collection of Hermes and Solka ties. He rarely left the house in anything but a three-piece suit. At home, he might take off his jacket and vest, but he never undid his tie until after dinner and never changed his clothes until it was time for bed. A loosened tie at the dinner table was a sure sign that he was upset about something. But now, early on a Friday afternoon, here he was, wearing only an open bathrobe, underpants, and knee-high black socks. My mother explained that he had taken off his clothes to move the television because he was afraid it would get them dirty. His gray hair was going this way and that. He kept tugging at one end of his mustache like he was trying to pull it off, one bare knee gyrating up and down like mine did when I was taking a test. Walter Cronkite was saying that the rumor that the president was dead was unconfirmed. Hope faded moments later, however, with the report that a priest had delivered the last sacrament. Next, he said that regarding the probable assassin, a young man has been taken into custody. My father leaned forward on the couch and mumbled something I couldn't catch, but Cronkite never finished his sentence. He paused, took off his glasses, and said, "We've just had a report from our correspondent, Dan Rather, in Dallas. He has confirmed that President Kennedy is dead." Whoosh! It was as everything solid and safe was sucked out of the world. My mother ran in and asked my father, "What's going to happen? What's going to happen?" Cronkite, struggling not to break down, quietly announced that it was official, that the president had died at 2 p.m. This was when my father spoke clearly for the first time, referring, as I understood immediately, to the assassin. He said, "I hope to God he wasn't Jewish." I've always thought of that moment I heard those 7 words as the moment when I fully understood for the first time how much, despite his determined self-transformation from uneducated shuttle boy to successful New York entrepreneur, my father's precarious youth still haunted him. As he sat in front of the television that afternoon in 1963, things that had happened just a few decades earlier, the threats of pogroms and conscription, the hazardous journey across half a continent and an ocean, must not have seemed very long ago. Only 20 years earlier, the Nazis ruled most of Europe. 1943 was the year the Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed. So when my father said what he said, something else became clear to me. Despite our celebrating both Hanukkah and Christmas, despite our breaking Yom Kippur fast by eating shrimp wrapped in bacon at King Dragon Chinese restaurant, despite my father's customers calling him Mr. Revere and him not correcting them, my father's store was called Revere Jewelers, and many of his WASP customers took to calling him Mr. Revere. Despite all of that, we were Jews. That was who we were. And being Jews, I realized, was nothing at all like being New Yorkers or Democrats or Brooklyn Dodgers fans. Clearly for my father, the Kennedy assassination awakened the ancient tribal anxiety he had probably convinced himself he had long since left behind. My worry that Friday was the generalized dread that I had caught from my father, that the assassination would mean the cancellation of my date the next night with Christine, a pretty blonde girl I'd been working up the courage to ask out for months, proving once and for all to me that fate was against me and against my ever getting anything I wanted. I remember thinking, why is this happening to me? As for my mother, I don't recall her sitting still for more than a minute the entire day. Her constant fretting over whether we were all right, whether we needed to eat something, what we should do about the doctor's appointment was the background music to everything that was happening on the television. By late afternoon, Lee Harvey Oswald had been identified as the assassin. My father could finally eat, and we had a dinner, plates on our laps in the living room for the very first time. When I got into bed that night, I could still hear the television through the wall. The next morning, my parents and I watched in horror, along with the rest of America, as Oswald was shot down by Jack Ruby. Then we learned that Jack Ruby's real name was Jack Rubenstein. My mother turned to my father and asked, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing for us, Nat?" So that's that. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for that heartfelt, poignant presentation. And now we look forward to all of your questions. And if you are on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. We have a computer that'll collect them, and Debbie will read them. And for those of you in the room, just raise your hand, and Debbie will bring the microphone to you. And, I see one question over here. It's Elliot.
I hope I wasn't sleeping, and I'm not asking a silly question, but did you show the caption and cartoon of the very first one that was accepted by the New Yorker?
I didn't. Would you like to know? I didn't show that cartoon. Would you like to know what it is? I can describe it to you.
Sure.
It's a meditation class, and there's a guru at the front, and next to the guru is a sign with the name of the course, The Road to Enlightenment. And one of the students is raising her hand and saying, "Are we there yet?" That's the first one I sold to the New Yorker. And I thought the caption, "Are we there yet?" really said a lot about the fact that it took me 25 years to get there.
Okay, well, we're waiting for another question. I have some. Can you tell us what the New Yorker cartoon editorial process is?
Sure.
What you go through?
It's painful. It's almost hard to talk about it. So much pain, but I'll try. We cartoonists hand in 10, 12, maybe even 15 rough ideas a week. And those ideas go to the cartoon editor, who goes through what must be over 1,000 cartoons a week. And out of those, she'll call out 50, maybe 60. And that's on Tuesday, which is our deadline. And then on Wednesday, she has the art meeting with David Remnick, the editor. And David is the one who makes the decisions about what gets bought and what doesn't get bought. And out of those 50 or 60, maybe 8 or 10 get picked. So we're talking about a lot of rejection, a lot of cartoons that get rejected. If you do what I do, you have to have a thick skin about rejection. And after 50 years, it's pretty thick. And that's mainly the process. And then you, as I said, you can wait sometimes weeks, sometimes years before that cartoon appears. But basically, that's what we go through. The only thing that's changed is back in the beginning, you brought your work in person, and you sat down with the cartoon editor and he went through your stuff. And at that, if you were a person who likes to suffer that kind of in-person pain, you did that. I tended to fax my ideas in or just drop them off. And these days it's all a lot easier because everything is done by email.
What?
We have a couple of Zoom questions. So Yvonne would like to know, you mentioned about your sister having problems. Are they outlined in the book?
Yes, I hesitate to tell you the story because that's one of the big reveals at the end of the book. But yes, my sister had a difficult life. And writing about it was the most challenging thing I had to deal with.
Thank you. One other question from Margot. How did you keep going for 25 years trying to get into the New Yorker? Did you make your living doing cartoons for other publications? And your persistence is amazing, she wants you to know.
Thank you. Yes, I was in every other possible magazine, newspaper you could possibly be in. I could not crack the New Yorker. And the reason I kept going is just basically because if you do what I do, making single panel cartoons, there's the New Yorker and then there's everything else. It's really, I only ever wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist. I didn't just want to be a cartoonist. From the time I was a kid and I saw those cartoons in the magazine, I knew that's what I wanted to do and be. And so I kept submitting because I felt like I didn't have a choice. I would never feel successful. I would never feel good about myself until I got in, and I just couldn't bear the idea of not getting in. So I would take a month or two off now and then, sometimes a couple of months, but mainly I just kept submitting and submitting. And I started to think, really, honestly, that it was their problem. It wasn't my problem. I have a lot of issues with self-confidence and stuff with self-doubt, stuff like that, but never about cartoons. From the time I was a kid, I always thought I was good at it. And I thought that it was their problem. They weren't seeing how good my cartoons were. And that belief just helped me keep submitting and submitting in spite of all that rejection.
I have more questions if no one else does, but you go first.
We have one
Good.
back here.
Good.
Hi, David. This is Debbie Noble. I wanted to ask you, you said at one point when we were talking a month or two ago about this being the first year that you tried to reach out to specifically Jewish audiences because you've been part of the Jewish book festivals around. How's it going, and what do you think of it?
Well, as the rabbi said in his introduction, we are the people of the book. And so a long time ago, my agent said, you got to do this Jewish Book Council thing. These are the people of the book. They're going to love your book. And it's the best audience. And I've really found that to be true. It's a wonderful audience for my book. My book is a little bit about a lot about being Jewish. And Jewish humor, as the rabbi also said, is a really crucial part of being who we are. And although I feel like the source of my humor comes from many places, my love of making jokes about my own suffering, I think, has a lot to do with the fact of my heritage. And it's been very gratifying to speak to Jewish audiences because they connect, they get it. So it's been a great experience doing this.
It's not about you, but it's about New Yorker humor. And inquiring minds want to know, whatever happened to the cursing mommy? We need her now more than ever.
To the what?
The cursing mommy?
You've lost me.
The cursing mommy in Shouts and Murmurs?
Oh, there have been some changes at the magazine. Not entirely comfortable talking about them, but I wish I could give you an answer. I don't really know. Things are very balkanized at a place like the New Yorker. As a cartoonist, I know next to nothing about what goes on in other areas of the magazine. So I can't really answer your question. I'm sorry that you're disappointed that it's gone, but that's all I can say.
Hi, David. This is Amy, the piano player. Thank you so much for your cartoons. They've been on the fridge ever since I was born, so I've been seeing them all my life. There's one cartoon that says, Michael, your father and I are worried that you're awfully young to be singing the blues. So I didn't play blues tonight, but I was curious to where that was inspired from, or what scenario was that?
I am a fan of the blues. And I've always wanted to make a cartoon about a kid musician. And like all my cartoons, that one just popped in my head. I happened to be watching, at the time, I was distracting myself from the fact that I couldn't come up with anything by watching Tedeschi Trucks Band on video, singing the blues. And the next thing I knew, I looked down at my page and I had drawn the kid with the guitar, and there was the cartoon. So, yeah.
Okay, keep
Hi,
going.
David. This is Barbara. You mentioned in the book that you and your family dined at Gino's Italian restaurant in Manhattan, and that your father had a lot of very famous clients. Did you ever think about cartooning them, especially the Gino's restaurant in New York?
Making cartoons about them. I think that a large portion of my cartoons are restaurant related. Certainly a huge percentage are food related. I'm a dedicated cook, and I love to make jokes about food, and specifically about restaurants. And many of my cartoons about restaurants are rooted in my memories of Gino's, dealing with the waiters, the menu, the thoughts that go through one's head. All those memories have fueled a lot of cartoon ideas. Nothing specific about them. But my memories are so vivid because you wouldn't believe the famous people that went in and out of there. I mean, there was one night when I looked back in the corner, and there was Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor and Peter O'Toole drunk, all three of them completely falling down drunk at the back of the restaurant. And as I was watching them, I turned and looked, and Joe DiMaggio came in the door with two women, one on each arm. And that was Gino's for me. So it was extremely memorable.
Okay, two more questions from our Zoom audience. Could you share with us some of the cartoonists that you admire the most?
Yeah, my great hero as a kid, and this is true of many cartoonists, was Saul Steinberg. And the funny thing about Steinberg is that he wasn't really a haha cartoonist, but he was a drawer. He was the greatest drawer of all time. And from him, I was inspired and learned the power of a line, what you could do with a line, the magical things he did with lines always inspired me. And I loved the simplicity of his cartoons and Thurber's cartoons and the artists that work the way I do with simple line drawings. I love Charles Addams because, and they're beautiful and they're complex and lots of ink washes. But I like my cartoons to look like David had an idea and he drew it. And that spontaneity is something I saw in some of those kinds of artists. The funniest cartoonist, in my opinion, and I think the main purpose of a cartoon is to be funny, is the great cartoonist Sam Gross. I don't know if you all are familiar with, I'm sure you are familiar with him. His most famous cartoon is the one of the frog in the French restaurant coming out, legless on one of those wheeled carts. And Sam he's just a genius and the funniest cartoonist that's ever lived. And there are many others, but those are my top ones.
We have time for one more, I think. Do cartoonists hang out with other cartoonists?
Okay, that's a little bit of a story. When I first came on the New Yorker, we had something called a cartoonist lunch. And every Tuesday, and this went on since 1925, cartoonists brought in their work and showed them to the editor, and then they gathered for a lunch. In our case, by the time I came on, it was at a place called the Pergola des Artistes, which was a French restaurant in the theater district that had an $8.95 lunch special and a free glass of wine. And the cartoonists would gather there, and that's where I met all my heroes and became friendly with my contemporaries, and it was a wonderful thing. But since the magazine moved down to the World Trade Center, that sort of, and then with COVID, that kind of get together has ceased to be possible. So I maintain good friendships, but mostly by email with my colleagues. Once in a while we have coffee, but it's not like the old days when we all got together like that.
Thank you. We've totally enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the book, What's So Funny? A Cartoonist's Memoir. This book is available for purchase right here, and if you're on Zoom, you can click the link in the chat. And it's wonderful. I've read it, and you already heard the author. And so I want to thank David, and I also want to thank now is the time to thank the committee for all the work we've all done. I want the committee members to stand up. Debbie Singer, Barbara Levinson, Shelley Klein, Barbara Droutman, Debbie Noble, Myra Weiss, and two could not be here, Denise Schaefer and Andrea Tarr. And I wanted to thank our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and our coordinator, Rebecca Russell, the Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we choose our authors, our in-house tech wizard, Lee Russell, and our remote New York tech wizard, Jake Tavel, and our literary circle members, whose financial support makes this entire festival possible. Thank you all. And I regret to inform you that the postponed author event with Ambassador Martin Indyk, which was rescheduled for this coming Tuesday, December 13th, has been indefinitely postponed due to Ambassador Indyk's health. His book, Master of the Game, is available tonight, or contact the Jewish Federation. So before we adjourn, let's have our raffle. So we have Andrea Kelly. Congratulations. Congratulations. Okay, so thank you again for joining us and supporting the Jewish Book Festival. We'll see you next year. And now, buy books, schmooze, and enjoy the Sisterhood's delicious reception.